Hey everybody, it's Joel, your photo troll, and I just wanted to make a video today about how having limited choices really helps you figure out photography. Because just having, say, one kind of film and one lens, it just defines your choices. You're like, okay, I've got ASA 400 film, and I've got an 85 millimeter 1.4 lens. So at 400 ASA indoors, I can go to f1.4 and get up to 125th, maybe a 250th of a second. Awesome for inside, right? And then say outdoors on a cloudy day, taking a tennis match or something like that, with that 85 1.4, I could go to a 500th of a second at f4, and it would just look fantastic. And then on a bright day, I'd be a thousandth of a second at f16, because that's really that's the maximum that you could do with that lens and the camera. My camera only would go to a thousandth of a second. So that's where using ASA 400, sometimes it was almost too fast to use if there was too much light. You know what I mean? But it's pretty rare when there's too much light. And then when there was a lot of light and I wanted like the highest quality for landscape or something like that, I'd go to ASA 125. And you could still use it indoors, but you'd have to get down to a 30th of a second at f1.4, you know? And then my dad used to use ASA 25 Kodachrome all the time and talk about hard to use because it's ASA 25. So on a bright sunny day, 1/25th of a second at f8. Okay, so you could, with my 1.4 85 millimeter lens, I could, get up to a thousandth of a second at f1.4, just amazing. But I just wanted to reiterate how having just one choice defines your actions. It's like, okay, I've got ASA 125, I'm going into an aquarium or something where there's just not a lot of light. I'm going to have to either use a very slow shutter speed and my wide open aperture, or I'm going to have to use a flash. Those are your two choices. It's like either slow it down as slow as you can hold it, or use your flash. And nowadays, in that situation, you can just crank your ISO up to 10,000, keep your shutter speed at 125th and go to f2, and everything would just look fantastic. But when you have the limited choices, it defines your actions, kind of, because I would go take football at night with ASA 400 film, and the only way I could do it would be to push my ASA 400 film up to 1200. So I'd set the meter on the camera to 1200, as high as it would go, and I put ASA 400 film in, so I was underexposing by 3 stops, and I only had one exposure, and that exposure was 125th of a second at f2.8. I was using an f2.8 lens at the time, so wide open, 125th of a second at ASA 1200. And the reason I needed 125th of a second is it was football. People were moving. If you use a 60th of a second, there's a lot of motion blur, and just every little motion that you make is exaggerated, and you can get a few pictures, but you lose a lot. You need 125th of a second to hold it and get everything sharp. So that would define my actions. I'd show up at the Fort Morgan football game and be like, oh man, there's hardly any light. I've got to go down to a 60th of a second at f2.8 ASA 1200. But that would hit my mind in the first second that I got there, and I would just set my exposure and look at my meter and be like, yep, that's it. And just by having the limited choices, it just tells you your answer. And then I also wanted to say how when you have limited choices in, say, lenses, you have the one lens, you don't have the whole closet full, but I just wanted to say, when you have the limited choices in lenses, you have the one lens. It's a 135 millimeter f2.8 lens, and that's the only lens you own. You just know it so well by the time, by the time you've used it for a year. You just know everything about it. You know your minimum focus distance. You never get too close to something because you know your minimum focus distance. Your framing for like portraits and groups of people, and you just know where you need to be. You can't zoom, you have to back up a certain distance. But I could look at 10 people in a group, tell them to get together, and I know I'd have to be 20 feet away to get them all, 30 feet away to get them all in there. So it just limits your limited choices defines your action. I knew I had to be a certain distance away, but it also gives you strict limitations, because at 135 millimeters, say in a room inside, I was too close. I would have to get out in the hallway or something and get them farther away so where I could, get the group in. But it just having the limited choices sort of defines what action you have to take. And it just really clarifies things in your mind. And going back to the ASA thing, it's like when you've got the one choice and you've got a suitcase with 10 rolls of ASA 400 film in there, you're not going to change ASA. You're going to change anything but. And you start to know exactly what exposure you're going to need, because you've only got that limited choice. It's like when it's dark, it's a 60th of a second at f2.8, and when it's lighter, it's a 250th of a second at f4, and when it's even lighter, it's 500th of a second at f8, and when it's like blaring sun, you can go 1,000th of a second at f16. And but that's like your 5 or 6 choices. But just by looking at the scene, I could be like, okay, f5.6 at 250th of a second. And look at my meter and be like, yep, there you go. But I think it just has helped me in photography in general, because I can just look at a scene and have a pretty good idea what my exposure is going to be. And then I also wanted to say that once you've got that manual exposure solid in your mind, any camera is the same. You can use a 8 by 10 inch view camera, and you're like, okay, I've got ASA 400 film. I know this is, f5.6 at a 250th of a second, and you just set your aperture to f5.6, and you find your shutter speed, you set it to a 250th, But, if you would probably have a limited choice there too, because some of those view cameras can only go to, say, a 60th of a second. So go to a 60th of a second and then shut your shutter speed to f22. And having the limited choice, you can run any camera, or knowing the manual exposure in and out, you can run any camera. Someone can hand you like the brand new Canon, whatever flagship, and I can just set it to manual and look at the scene and be like, okay, f1.4 at a 500th of a second, look at the meter, be like, yep, it's like the principle still applies no matter what camera you have, And once you're in manual, any camera is the same. And D200 in manual, it's still a 60th of a second at f8. And then someone gives you a D3 in manual, it's still, 125th of a second at f8. It's just like the exposure doesn't change no matter what the equipment is. And so I think that's very valuable. Once you have your manual exposure mentally in your mind, any camera is the same. Someone can say, okay, I've got ASA 125 in this box camera. Go take a picture or something for me. And you can be like, okay, I'm at ASA 125. I know what my exposure is basically just by thinking about it, And, or someone can hand you the brand new Leica or whatever, and you can just set it to manual, and the exposure is the exact same as it would be through your Brownie camera. You know what I mean? So anyway, that's just the point I wanted to make there, is just limited choices can kind of help you master photography sometimes, whether it's having limited choices in ASA or limited choices in lenses. Sometimes that's the way you truly learn what your equipment can do, So just a thought. This is Joel, your photo troll. I'll talk to you down the river.